Howdy, Spurs students. We are back to talk about logos and logical appeals for a second video. Okay, when last we talked, right, we described logical appeals as units of argumentation including both a claim and a proof. And we defined a proof as good reasons or good evidence that an audience might find persuasive that would support that claim. Now, we talked about evidence last time, but we really didn't discuss good reasons. Reasons answer the question of why, or more generally, in what way, in relation to a claim. They explain why we should take an action or hold a belief on a certain claim. And in the real world, you'll find that reasons often follow after the word because. Unlike good evidence, though, they don't use facts, data, or testimony to support the claim. Instead, they present themselves as extrapolations of the claim, or as common sense. Let's take a look at an example. Here is Vice President Joe Biden again. Actually, this is way back in 1992 when he was just on the Senate hearing committee. Here's a quote from him in 1992. Given the unusual rancor that prevailed, rancor is like argumentation, bitter argumentation, really angry, venomous argumentation. Given the unusual rancor that prevailed in the Thomas nomination, he's talking about the nomination of Clarence Thomas for Supreme Court Justice, which happened in 1991, I believe, and the overall level of bitterness that sadly infects our political system and this presidential campaign already. It is my view that the prospects for anything but conflagration, a giant fire, with respect to a Supreme Court nomination this year are remote at best. So the claim here is that the prospects for a smooth Supreme Court nomination are remote at best, according to Biden. And he supports this claim with two pieces of reasoning. First, he says the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings were extremely contentious. He doesn't give us evidence to support that. He gives us that as a reason to support his claim. And secondly, he says the political process is infected with partisanship and bitterness. Using those two reasons, he supports his claim that we should conclude that right now is not a good time for a Supreme Court nomination. So when the concepts that connect a claim and its evidentiary proof are explicit, we call those reasons. Or, as we just saw, a claim can be supported by good reasons, but no evidence. That is to say, reasons are a part of the proof. They're a part of the thing that supports a claim that are explicitly stated by the author or the writer. Often, however, there's no explicit reasoning connecting a claim and its evidence. When that happens, our minds have to infer the reasoning. That is, we have to make the connection between the claim and the evidence ourselves. I asked you to think about this last time in the previous video when I presented an argument saying that climate change was happening, and then I gave two pieces of evidence to back it up. There, our minds have to infer the connection between the evidence that's being presented and the claim that's being made. And sometimes even when explicit reasons are presented, we make those inferential connections. Those connections, the jump that we have to make as to how a claim and an evidence are connected, is called the warrant. Warrants are explanations that we know to be true, or that we think we know to be true, and they generally seem sound or to make sense for the claim and evidence. If you recall, back when we talked about ideologies and commonplaces, we talked about common sense and how oftentimes writers appeal to common sense to justify what is in fact ideology. This is kind of similar. Warrants are explanations that seem like common sense to an audience that accepts the assumptions underneath them. What does that mean? Let's talk about it. Let's break it down a little bit. Warrants sound complicated. They're kind of forbidding to explain. If you start talking about the inferential jump that we make between a claim and the evidence, that sounds complicated, but we use them every day. Consider these two sentences. It's raining outside. It's a bad day to have a picnic. I think, despite this picture of sort of sad-looking people eating at a picnic table in the rain, we all agree with that, right? It's a bad idea to have a picnic in the rain. The claim is it's a bad day to have a picnic, right? The evidence, rain. It's raining outside. The warrant is the set of assumptions or the jump that we make to connect those two together. One way of thinking through this warrant is to say it's unpleasant or unhealthy to be outside in the rain for a prolonged period. It's not fun to sit in the rain. Picnics happen outside, so why should I want to go to a picnic when it's raining? The warrant is simply that unstated part of the argument, that unstated assumption that connects the claim and the evidence together. Let's look at another one. The example here, she must be smart. She went to Harvard, after all. Take a second and see if you can figure out what's the claim, what's the evidence, and what's the warrant. So hopefully you figured out the claim is she must be smart, right? We're making an assertion about someone here. What's the evidence? Well, the evidence is that she went to Harvard. So what's the warrant? What's the assumption or the reasoning that is unspoken that underlies this logical argumentation? Well, the warrant might be, right, that only intelligent people are accepted to Ivy League universities like Harvard. Maybe you agree with that. Maybe that's an assumption that you have, but perhaps you don't. So if you don't agree with this warrant, if you're not part of those cultural assumptions, you're unlikely to agree with this logical argumentation, right? You're likely to say, there's a disjunction between the claim and the evidence, and I don't agree. So, this is why warrants matter. Warrants speak to the shared cultural assumptions and the values active in a rhetorical community. For the members of that community, they act as a valuable shorthand. That is, they leave out all this information that doesn't need to be explained to the members of that community because they all agree on it. So they can be really important for us as rhetoricians to unpack because they help us access what the rhetor believes to be the values and the assumptions of that community. Logical arguments are successful if they speak to those assumptions, if they somehow address those shared cultural assumptions and values. They're much less likely to be successful if we don't share the warrant. Another important thing to note is that when we talk about rhetorical commonplaces, remember commonplaces are those sentences or sayings that are commonly asserted by a community and that can be seen in many different places being shared by that community. Rhetorical commonplaces are simply logical arguments that have been truncated down into just the claim because they don't need to include any evidence or they don't need to include any forms of proof because the audience already accepts them. That's why, for instance, if you're part of a community that supports the Black Lives Matter movement, you recognize Black Lives Matter as a rhetorical commonplace, and you don't go around explaining it to everybody who also is part of that group. However, if you support Black Lives Matter and you run into someone who doesn't, then you have to do some more unpacking, right? Because they say, well, all lives matter. And you argue, you say yes, right? That's the argument, is that in fact all lives matter. And Black Lives Matter is simply a commonplace asserting that we need to also publicly value Black lives. Okay, let's get a little more practice. 2 statements follow below. So what are the claims and proofs presented for each? What might be some of the warrants for each argument? So I'm going to give you some time to work with these, and then we'll break them down together, right? The first statement, after-school jobs are bad for high school students because they use up valuable study time. What are the claims and the proofs? What might be some of the warrants for that argument? The second argument, we should strengthen the Endangered Species Act because doing so will preserve the diversity of species on the planet. Again, what is the claim? What is the proof presented? What might be some of the warrants for that argument? I'll be quiet for about 10 seconds, but of course, pause this as you need. Okay, let's start with argument number 1. After-school jobs are bad for high school students because they use up valuable study time. Well, the claim here is that after-school jobs are bad for high school students, right? The proof here is a bit of reasoning, right? And notice that it follows that sentence, that word because, right? They use up valuable study time. That's the reasoning. There's no evidence presented there. They don't say a study done in 2015 shows that they take up 40 hours a week or whatever. This is just reasoning. So what might be some warrants? Well, might be a cultural assumption here is that students only have time to do one thing, either work or study, or that the experiences a job provides are less important than what students learn in school, or that studying is the only way to learn or to pass a test, or that all students are financially privileged enough not to have to work after school. Each one of those is an assumption that might be at play. Each one of those is a possible warrant for someone who would accept this argument or be likely to accept this argument. If you didn't accept this argument, it's likely that you would argue with one of these warrants, right? You would really take issue with the assumption or the underlying value that the person is bringing to the table. Okay, so for argument 2, we should strengthen the Endangered Species Act because doing so will preserve the diversity of species on the planet. Well, the claim here, right, is we should strengthen the ESA. The proof, again, this is reasoning, right? It follows a because. Doing so preserves the diversity of species on Earth. Okay, well, hopefully here we can start to really see some warrants in action, right? Some of the warrants might be that the ESA is effective and actually protects endangered species, that this act really works. The belief that the government should be active in regulating what happens to animals. The belief that the diversity of species is important or beneficial to the planet. Each of those warrants is actually something that we could quarrel with or argue with. It would be easy for us to think up counterexamples or think up counter arguments that might bring into question those possible warrants. Let's return to Biden's argument just to take another example then, right? And this is where his claim is that the prospects for a nomination are remote at best, that the confirmation hearings were contentious, that the political process is infected with partisanship and bitterness. So some possible warrants here that confirmation hearings should be peaceful or should be easy, that bipartisan politics shouldn't be bitter, that the political system in 1992 was heavily divided. And there are other ways to think through this too. But these are some of the possible assumptions that someone who accepts Biden's argument brings to the table. Warrants are a great place to think through when you get to Unit 3 how you might argue with someone else's argument. If there's an opposing argument, it's unlikely that you'll argue with their data, but it's very likely that you'll argue with the warrant, with the assumptions that they bring when they mash together a claim and the proof that supports it. Okay, so we've talked a lot about logos over the past 2 videos. So here's how to discuss logical appeals in your papers when you write your essay 2. Good discussions of logos are going to focus on all 3 elements of a logical appeal. They're going to talk about the claim, they're going to talk about the proof, and they're going to talk about the warrant. You're going to identify all 3 of those elements and you're going to evaluate them keeping the audience in mind. Do you think they're successful, persuasive for that audience? Why or why not? Successful logical arguments present consistent claims, appropriate proofs, good evidence drawn from good resources, and good reasons that make sense, and warrants that align with an audience's values and beliefs. Unsuccessful logical arguments fail on one or more of the levels. The claims are inconsistent. They're missing. Untrustworthy or just plain bad proofs. Oh, let's back up. Unsuccessful logical arguments fail on one or more levels. Inconsistent claims, claims that don't match up across the course of the whole argument. Missing, untrustworthy, or just plain bad proofs. The evidence comes from weird places. There's not enough evidence, or what evidence is there just doesn't seem very credible. And lastly, misjudged warrants, right? Perhaps the assumptions in the opinion piece don't line up with the assumptions that you think the audience is likely to have. So your duty as a rhetorical analyst is to identify all three elements, to talk about all three elements, and then to evaluate them, to say what's successful and what's not successful. So hopefully that helps. I know this can be kind of a complicated place to think through, but it's really fun and challenging and interesting to start to think about the warrants for an argument, to start to think about how each logical appeal includes assumptions or inferential leaps that we have to unpack to see if this actually makes sense. Okay, good luck working with logical appeals. We'll be back soon to talk about Unit 3. See ya.